The weighted dreams. The morning sun filtered through the dust-covered windows of Marcus Thompson's small apartment, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk where bills lay scattered like fallen leaves. He sat hunched over his laptop, fingers hovering above the keyboard, staring at the blinking cursor on an empty document. The coffee in his mug had grown cold hours ago, forgotten in the weight of his thoughts. Marcus had always dreamed of being a writer. As a child in suburban Ohio, he would spend entire afternoons crafting stories about distant worlds and brave heroes. His elementary school teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had once told his mother that Marcus had a gift with words. Those 4 words had shaped the next 20 years of his life, carrying him through high school, college, and now into his late 20s, where reality had begun to chip away at the edges of his dreams like rust on old metal. The rejection letter from his 5th publisher sat folded in his back pocket, the paper soft from being handled too many times. "While your writing shows promise, we don't feel this manuscript fits our current catalog." The same polite dismissal he'd received 4 times before, each one landing with the dull thud of a door closing. Outside his window, the city hummed with purpose. People walked briskly along the sidewalks, briefcases in hand, heading to jobs that paid well and provided security. Marcus watched them sometimes, wondering if they had ever chased something as uncertain as a dream. His own job at the downtown bookstore barely covered rent and groceries, leaving little room for anything else. His manager, Sarah, was kind but practical. "You're talented, Marcus," she would say while restocking shelves, "but talent doesn't pay the bills." The phone rang, cutting through the morning quiet like a sharp knife. Marcus glanced at the caller ID and saw his sister Emma's name. He let it ring twice more before answering, not quite ready for her weekly check-in that always seemed to highlight how far behind he was falling in the race of life. "Hey, Em," he said, trying to inject energy into his voice. "Marcus, how are you holding up?" Her voice carried the warm concern of someone who had never doubted her path. Emma worked as a nurse at the children's hospital, a job that felt as solid and meaningful as the ground beneath her feet. "I'm good, just working on some new material." The lie came easily now, worn smooth by repetition. "That's wonderful. No, my friend Jessica just got promoted at her marketing firm. They're looking for content writers. I could put in a good word." Marcus closed his eyes and listened to his sister's well-meaning suggestions, each one a small reminder that the world expected him to choose security over dreams. After promising to think about it, he hung up and returned to staring at the empty document where his latest story was supposed to bloom into existence. Days blended into each other like watercolors in the rain. Marcus would work at the bookstore, come home, and sit before his laptop until exhaustion forced him to bed. The routine felt like walking in circles, each step taking him nowhere closer to his destination. He began to notice things he had ignored before: the way successful authors' books seemed to mock him from the store shelves, the casual confidence of customers who spoke about their careers as if they had always known their place in the world. One particularly gray Thursday afternoon, as rain drummed against the bookstore windows, an elderly man shuffled through the door. His white hair was damp from the weather, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to navigate the world slowly. He browsed for nearly an hour before approaching the counter with a worn copy of a poetry collection. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice soft but clear. "I'm looking for the author's other works, Robert Chen. Do you know if he's written anything else?" Marcus checked the computer system and shook his head. "This appears to be his only published book, sir. It came out about 3 years ago." The old man nodded thoughtfully, running his fingers along the book's spine. "He was my student, 30 years ago. Brilliant mind, but he was convinced he wasn't good enough. Took him decades to finally share his words with the world." The man looked up at Marcus with eyes that held the wisdom of someone who had seen many seasons change. "Some seeds take longer to grow than others, but that doesn't make the fruit any less sweet." After the man left, Marcus found himself holding the poetry book, reading the brief biography on the back cover. Robert Chen had published his first collection at 62, after a career as a high school English teacher. The poems inside spoke of patience, of small moments that contained entire universes, of dreams that aged like wine in the darkness, until they were ready to be shared. That evening, Marcus walked through his neighborhood as the sun set behind the buildings, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. He passed a small community garden tucked between 2 apartment buildings, where an older woman tended to a patch of vegetables. Her hands moved with practiced care as she watered tomato plants that had grown heavy with fruit. "Beautiful evening," Marcus said, stopping at the garden's edge. The woman looked up and smiled. "Indeed it is. These tomatoes are finally ready after months of waiting. People think gardening is about planting seeds, but really it's about learning to wait for the right season." Marcus nodded, understanding something he couldn't quite put into words yet. He thanked the woman and continued walking, his steps feeling lighter than they had in weeks. When he returned to his apartment, Marcus sat at his desk and began to write. Not the novel he had been struggling with, not the short stories that felt forced and hollow, but something different. He wrote about the old man in the bookstore, about the poetry that waited 30 years to be born, about the gardener whose patience had been rewarded with abundance. The words flowed like water finding its natural course, steady and sure. For the first time in months, Marcus didn't check the clock or worry about whether his writing was good enough for publication. He simply let the story tell itself, trusting that his hands knew how to shape the thoughts that had been growing quietly in his mind. Hours later, he sat back and read what he had written. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't the commercial success he had once imagined would solve all his problems. But it was honest, and it was his, and for the first time in a long while. That felt like enough. Not Marcus understood now that growth wasn't always about reaching the destination quickly. Sometimes it was about learning to find meaning in the journey itself, about discovering that success wasn't just about external validation but about becoming the person capable of creating something worthwhile. Even if the world took its time in noticing, he saved the document, closed his laptop, and looked out at the city lights twinkling like stars. Tomorrow he would return to work at the bookstore, and he would come home and write again. That bills would still need paying, and the rejections might still come. But he now carried with him the quiet knowledge that some dreams are worth pursuing not because they promise easy rewards, but because they transform us into the people we were meant to become. In the gentle darkness of his small apartment, Marcus Thompson smiled and began to plan his next story, understanding finally that the weight of dreams was not a burden to be carried, but wings learning slowly how to fly.